Joining me today for our deep dive are two men who I think are two of the smartest thinkers that we've had on the show in the past. Both of them were guests separately on the Other Side Interviews show that we did for a few weeks last year, where we just have someone on for a long podcast style interview. Both of them are not all that well known, but both those shows got big viewership because these guys and their ideas are pretty interesting. Scott Pelto is a businessman and commercial head of one of Brisbane's leading local law firms. Scott has an interesting background and a mix of experience. He finished high school in the 1980s and he went into the police force for 11 years, where he spent 5 years as a criminal law prosecutor. While in the police service, he completed a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Commerce degree that took him into accounting. He became an auditor and worked for one of the big four firms, Deloitte, bringing his policing and accounting experience together in forensic accounting and heading up the Brisbane office of Deloitte Forensic. Rob McMullen is a local small businessman, occasional politician and passionate thinker who studies the concept of natural law, a theory that might help us understand the political, economic, social and philosophical wackiness of our times. Natural law is a theory in philosophy that says that all humans are born with an inherent universal set of moral rules that govern human conduct. These laws aren't imposed by governments or imposed by courts, but they're our inherent sense of right versus wrong or justice. We had a fascinating discussion on the show last year all about that. Welcome back, Rob. Welcome back, Scott. It's great to have you both here.
Damian.
Hey, mate.
So, guys, the point of the show is that leftism is everywhere at the moment. It's infiltrated, as we said in the opener, our schools, it's infiltrated media. They've got control of the media. They're in our political system because we don't really have a strong right-wing, conservative or even centre-right party anymore. They're now in capital, which is amazing, right? They've infiltrated corporations and business and through ESG and DEI. So there seems to be a fundamental problem that most Aussies, especially the young, seem to have no understanding of what our system is and how it works, right? The idea that the liberal free market is not something that just fell out of the sky, that it evolved, that it's got a system attached to it, that capitalism has a system to it that actually works and alleviates poverty. We're not teaching that stuff at schools, and kids aren't hearing it. So, Scott, where does that all stem from, that ignorance that kids seem to have these days of capitalism, of liberal economics?
Well, Damian, I imagine that it has come from people like us not teaching kids about responsibility. It's one of the foundations, obviously, of reciprocal cooperation between individuals. And if they don't understand that responsibility, has an element of effort and suffering, and we have to embrace that to effectively, find fulfillment. Now, these kind of words are not the kind of words that younger people want to hear. They would much prefer to hear ideological slogans that suggest things come a lot easier, and that's the direction that they want to head in.
And that's what the Greens do, obviously. It's just a message that you can have everything you want, and if you don't have anything or you're miserable, it's somebody else's fault. It's the boomers, or it's the nasty capitalists, or it's whoever the oppressor might be in that narrative. But you're basically saying we can't absolve ourselves of responsibility. Well, we've somehow failed as Gen X or boomers to educate, to mentor, to be there. I mean, that would be consistent with your natural law theory, I guess.
Yeah, well, look, I'd like to first off say that the Greens are always targeting young people because children are not responsible. They're not as responsible as adults, so that's our starting state. But what we actually have to do is grow into being trained into responsibility. So there's a process there, but for their own political goals, it's in their interest to interrupt that process and keep people in a dependent state because that suits, like I said, their political goals. But we talked a lot about entropy, and I find it a fascinating concept because it is a force of nature that any structure without a continual input of energy is going to entropy. Things are going to fall apart. If I don't eat, I will fall apart. If you don't restore a home, it'll fall apart. If you don't repaint a house, it'll fall apart.
We live in a universe of entropy.
Well, right? It's a constant force of nature. through time, things are breaking down through time. And what you really find when you talk to a lot of left-wing activists about their worldview is they don't have an understanding of this fact. You know, they say things like, well, if we just redistributed all the money, everyone would have enough. But that's not a through time understanding
of reality.
No, that's like taking a screenshot of a movie and thinking that's all there is, just the screenshot, just frozen in time. But you know, money is something that happens through time. Entropy is a constant force which we're always trying to outrun. And it is part of the natural world, and that ties in with our natural law thing. So to mirror
well, philosophers and religious people would say we live in a broken world, a fallen world, right? The concept of the fallen world, which is a lot of religions.
Yeah.
So you know, that would be, you've got to work to make to even maintain the status quo, because the tendency is to entropy.
That's right.
So the idea of responsibility.
Yeah, and I think I'd taken up on Rob's point that one of the things they talk about is if we redistributed all the money, then everything would go okay. That to me shows a fundamental lack of understanding of what money is.
Yeah.
Because you know, if I take a couple of minutes to explain that quickly, you know, money is a medium of exchange and nothing more. It has fundamental elements. One element is that it's a store of value, you know, where you can store value over time. It transgresses over time.
Yeah, so yeah.
You know, and another fundamental element is it's got to be infinitely divisible, so that we can buy anything from, you know, a cup of coffee to an island in the Caribbean,
right,
that kind of thing.
Yep.
So if you focus on the purpose and the function of money, which is to, you know, capture the value of an item, a product
in a particular
of some
time and geography, in a way, and transport it to another time and geography.
And then take that representation of that value in the money and move it forward.
Yep.
You'll understand that the primary focus is on the product. It's not the money. So really you need to, if you were going to talk in that way, you would have to say, well, let's take all of the product and distribute that, you know, across everybody. But as we know, that's, you know, the product once distributed is gone.
Right.
So there's a never-ending cycle.
And what they don't realise, right, is that once you do that, once you take that product off someone who's produced it and you redistribute it to someone who hasn't produced it, you've just incentivised the behaviour of the person who isn't producing by rewarding them for not producing, and you've penalised the behaviour of the person who produced by taking half of their earnings off them.
You've increased the entropy in the system.
You've increased the entropy in the system,
So, you know, maybe the other important thing to get across, and, you know, this will come down to government's role in the process, is the monetary system that we've now operated under for a little over 100 years is what they call a fiat monetary system. So fiat means by decree, you know, decreed by an authority, in this case government. So we know that the paper notes or the plastic notes have no intrinsic value whatsoever. The only reason they have value is because there is a decree that they will represent, you know, value.
Well, once upon a time it was backed by gold. We came off the gold standard in, what, the 60s, the 70s. We've had this floating currency situation. Without getting into the theory of money too much, we would be there all day. But basically the idea that you can just print more money, which is the basis of Keynesian economics, or modern monetary theory is the extreme version of that, that the Greens actively promote, right? The socialists actively promote, government can just keep... Well, the reason they promote that is it is a form of redistribution, right? It's a form of devaluing the money of those who've got that money and have saved it and giving it to others.
Well, to get to the end point really quickly, because as you say, it's a long conversation, but the bottom line of it all is when we went off the gold standard and fiat money ruled the economies of all Western democracies, that means that the governments control the monetary system. So when the governments control the monetary system, they have at their disposal the power to, in essence, appropriate the entire wealth of countries. The entire wealth.
Okay, let's just repeat that point. They have within their power the ability to appropriate all the money, all of the wealth, all the actual wealth.
They control the system. So, you know, as they print it, you know, and it's not just printing money, it's credit terms as well, because providing credit is the same as creating money. If there's not something there to back it, and you create the credit, that's the same as creating more money. And everybody knows that more money means more inflation, but and that of course is the cost.
Well, does everybody know that? Does the average kid?
I'm
If you walk out, yeah, right. I mean, if you walk down the
skeptical.
street, you said to a kid, you know, hey, why doesn't the government just print more money? And you have to explain to them, well, you know, if there's $100 in the system and your apple, you know, costs you, you know, is worth $5 today, and then you print another $100, then there's $200 in the system. Guess what happens to the price of your apple? It goes up to $10. So
you can increase the money supply if there's also a corresponding increase in goods and services, i.e. reciprocal value to people. But if you don't actually have an increase in production, you have an increase in the money supply, you'll get inflation.
Yeah. So that, you know, you know, at the core of it, there's an understanding. This is what we're talking about today. Really, is that limits. You know, should there be limits imposed on the powers that governments have? And when you come down to the core system, which is the money supply, you know, subject to them allowing inflation to run away, they can, in essence, print or you know, issue credit any amount of money, which effectively appropriates the entire wealth of the nation. They have the system. Under the gold standard, you know, another element of money is that it's got to be in scarce supply. It can't be an unlimited supply, because if it is an unlimited supply, then
it's worthless.
You know,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. So scarcity has to be enforced somehow, and we enforce it with the government controls. But if the government wants to, it can print more money, and therefore it takes. But where the left get confused is they think, oh, the government's printing more money, they're creating more value in the system. No, they're not. You can't create more value in the system unless you have productive work.
All the value.
Someone has to do stuff.
All the value is in what we produce.
Yes.
All of it.
Yes. So that's the problem. So we get to redistribution, and we're talking about taking value from person A or group A that's productive and giving it to group B that's not productive. Now, social security, baseline, sort of, you know, looking after people, making sure that they can eat and have a bit of shelter is something you want to have in a civilized society, and that's why we have a degree of social security. But you know, it's easy for the left to say, well, you know, isn't everybody entitled to an education? Isn't everybody entitled to free healthcare? And it sounds like, well, yeah, you know, everyone should get a free education. Everyone should get free healthcare. Everyone should get but how do we deal with that? I mean, where do you draw the line and say, well, we just can't afford it, or
Well, I think it's all about understanding. So, you know, and I can see why people get maybe misguided or misled, you know, by money. You've really got to understand that it's nothing more than a medium of exchange for what lies underneath it. So you talk about a free health system. Well, I would say to you, Damian, do the nurses and doctors work for free?
No, I mean, sorry, I don't mean that there is a free health system. I mean, there's value and effort put in that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I get your point. So the question I'm asking is, you know, where do you draw the line? And the socialists would say, well, you draw the line pretty far up the chain. So it's like, you know, the NHS in the UK, or you have completely free health care. You have completely free education system.
Well,
but you're going to go broke if you keep doing that, right?
this is where I would say you draw the line. You know, it's important to understand that we have to have a system of government. We have to have the rule of law. Without those things, we can't cooperate reciprocally in society and exchange goods. Okay. They're part of the mechanism. But if that goes too far, you know, then in essence, and particularly with the monetary system that we have, because money is a store of value going into the future. So when you save those dollars in your pocket, that's effort that you put into today
that you want to reap in the future.
Exactly, to save for tomorrow. So
if the government prints more money, they're stealing that from me.
Yeah, and you know, that's
my kids.
You know, at a higher level, metaphorically, maybe you could say that that's your destiny. You know, it's your effort that you you know, went to today, for sacrifice today for something for tomorrow. Yeah. So, you know, where do you draw the line? Given that when the government appropriates money, prints it or taxes it or takes it in any indirect manner, you know, it's not taken in a voluntary way. So, Rob will talk
Okay,
about
take
the
it by
elements.
force.
Well,
all right, so let's go
it's
to that.
involuntary.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So involuntary means we're coming to get it whether you like it or not. And if you don't pay your taxes, we're putting you in jail. So what does that do to the motivation of the person who earned the money, who made the money, and how does that tie in with natural law?
Well, like we said before in our first chat, incentives are what exist. If you disincentivize people to produce, then they don't. And to tie into what Scott's saying, I think what you mean by destiny is, usually the right is capitalizing. We look at increasing wealth through time. One of the main drives of the left is consumption. They want to consume. And so you've got consumption versus capitalizing. You're talking about capitalizing. You're obviously a capitalizing person.
yes.
And the left are hyper-consumptive. So they think they can consume from the system, and I don't think they have an awareness that you can actually consume the systems that create the wealth in the first place. I don't think that's part of their worldview.
Well, I think that's where we're at in Australia. I don't think kids understand that.
They don't understand.
Money doesn't grow on trees, that the government can't just print it and hand it out, and it's going to have the same value as it had yesterday.
They don't understand. Yeah. And,
well, it's like the shoplifting thing. Sorry to interrupt, but that Jonathan Sree, saying, oh, we should shoplift. It's like, mate, you're stealing from, it's okay because it's Coles and Woolies and they're big. You're stealing from the shareholders of Coles and Woolies, firstly. You're stealing from the staff of Coles and Woolies.
You're making the price of food at Coles and Woolies increase.
So you're stealing from the other customers, right? I've got to pay for that shoplifting later. It's like there's no concept of this value. Kids don't have this idea in their mind that there's any repercussion of this or any... So,
Well, that's what I talked about, interrupting that process of adulting.
Right.
That interrupting that process of growing people into adult responsibility. And that's where we're at. One of the gripes I have with a lot of conservative commentators is to say, well, they'll learn when it hits the back pocket, when the consequences hit. That assumes a lot. I think that assumes that people actually are responsible adults mentally, and that they will understand the causality. I'm very skeptical of that. I don't think they will.
Happening, Rob.
It's not happening.
No, it's not happening with Gen Y. They've found that as they're getting into the 40s, which they are now, the older ones are like 43 of the millennial generation, that they're not shifting their politics as we did in Gen X and the boomers, to the right. As you grow up, you become more aware of these things and you change your thinking.
Well, we're worried about the increase in Green votes in Brisbane, and I think it's indicative of an interruption into what we call adult responsibility, looking at the system as a whole, understanding the incentives that drive the whole system. They're really just more like thinking in the now, localized, hyper-consumptive. I can take that for me. And they take for granted the system. But I think with the cost of living, obviously so many economic hardships imposed by the government's response to COVID, people are doing it tough, and I don't think they are understanding the causality there. I don't think they're understanding the causality between the entropy in the system, the lack of money, how hard it is for everybody, and they're funneling people into the Greens. And so to wrap up my entire point very specifically, I think largely the left is going to left. I don't think they're ever going to get it.
Right.
I think there needs to be a counterbalancing force from people who are responsible, from conservatives, adult conservatives who go, you know what, I'm voting and I'm looking at the system beyond what suits me right now. I'm looking at the whole system through time, and as Scott said, largely conservatives have abdicated responsibility. I would say, like any system will entropy if you stop inputting energy into it. The people who are responsible have stopped putting energy into teaching young people. I think that's largely what's happening. So to give a concrete example, if you'd like, an example of energy is having a uncomfortable conversation with people. That takes energy to tell people something they don't want to hear. But I mean, I do that out of a sense of responsibility sometimes. Imagine we're talking about money as exchange of value. Imagine saying to a young left-wing person, if you've got no money, it's because you don't provide anything of value. I've done that a few times, and they freak out. They freak out. But it's the stark truth. I mean, there's a lot of people that you will encourage and nudge in certain ways. Usually What I'm saying is be lovingly blunt, and you might follow that up with, but I'd love to help you
Right.
develop into somebody that does create value.
Right.
Well,
Be a
that's
mentor.
that's the responsible thing to do, is to offer a solution.
That's right.
you
That's
know,
right.
In that circumstance.
That's right. And I think that's largely what's got to happen. You talk about capital going woke and things, is that people who have capital and responsibility, and look, there's a lot of, I don't want to go down the path of like a generation war, but it is the stark reality these days that the older generations have the lion's share of the time, lion's share of life experience, lion's share of wealth, and the lion's share of political agency. And so if
So
they...
you're talking boomers and older Gen X.
Look, from the numbers I've seen, it's like 55 and up. Compared to 55 and down, they have a lot more political agency, time, life experience, and monetary wealth. And so I think I would encourage anyone listening to that to think about, if the system's going to persist, if the people who have the capacity to input energy into it don't.
Yeah.
If the people who have an asymmetry of capacity for responsibility don't take responsibility. And a lot of that is mentoring young people. Look, I will say, I was a young lefty. I came out of university degree. To be honest, because of my miseducation, it probably took me to my mid-20s to actually stop believing it was immoral to make money.
Yeah, right.
And you know what a behind the
That's
eight ball?
extraordinary.
It is, no. And
You're the only millennial in this room.
well, I'm being completely honest.
Yeah.
It was my mid-20s when I heard older men say to me, it's, if you're providing a good reciprocal service, you're providing value to another person, it's not immoral to ask for a price.
No.
It's not, but that's what I believed.
Right. That's how.
And the way I came out of that is I worked in a small business with a boss who would tell me about how to run a business on a lunch break.
Yep.
I worked with people in my industry, and I found a lot of people on the internet talking about politics and philosophy and natural law and things like that. So I was able to get myself out of it. But I could only do that because I was shown a pathway. And what worries me now is what we're seeing with this Greens vote is like people are going to strive one way or another, but the Greens, set up all of these preconditions and then offer a solution which is their political goal in the first place. And we're losing people to that ideology because people, they're facing very real hardships with housing and cost of living. And if you don't want people to go down that pathway, you've got to guide them this way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In essence, you've got to do that in a selfless way.
That's right.
Talking about the people that are 55 and over, they're quite comfortable. They can make it easily for the remaining days of their life.
That's right.
But they have a responsibility in a selfless way to assist.
So we're not doing enough.
We're not assisting.
We've also let kids down, I think, at the boomer level. We've let kids down. We haven't perhaps educated them quite the way we should have. We're not mentoring. Let's talk about men. What's happened to the role of men in society? There's a traditional male mentoring, no disrespect to women because they have a role to play here too, but men, the role of the man in Australian society at least has become quite degraded, quite looked down upon, quite frowned upon.
Well, it's always an uncomfortable conversation, but as you say, we've got to address it. Fundamentally, I think we all acknowledge that men and women are different. It's the way we're born. We have, women who obviously are the people that give birth to every single person on the planet. They fundamentally have, they're fundamentally more nurturing and more caring than men, for example, who come at it from a different perspective. Now, that in no way means that women can't do anything they want. I've got two.
Well, the men are worse than women anyway.
I've got
it's equal, but not equal, but not the same.
I've got two daughters who I will tell every day of the week they can do anything they want and become anything they want. That doesn't mean there are not natural tendencies toward things.
Oh, that's right.
And people will find fulfillment, following what they naturally, tend to do.
But Rob, you spoke about men mentoring men and fathering, and we've seen that in the United States. The problem with the absent father, the impact that has on society. The role of the father is not something that we put on a pedestal in Australia. It's something that we mock in advertising. It's the doofus dad, icon that we sort of everybody stereotype that everyone jokes about.
I'm going to go there.
Go there, brother.
I'm going to go there.
Go there, brother. It's the brotherhood.
You look at a lot of the social science. There's a lot of it out there. There's a general. It's not always a one-to-one, but there's a general trend that left is a political manifestation of the feminine, and the right is a political manifestation of the masculine. And we talk about feminine consumption, masculine capitalizing. And that's why you have a show talking about the GDP and economics. It's going to be a lot of older blokes. And then you look at any Labor policy pandering to women, they know that the left is largely
has the caring bias.
It's the empathetic bias, empathetic feminine bias. You know, in the psychological science, you've got feminine empathetic cognitive bias, versus, which means that they're very tuned. It doesn't mean you can't think of other things, but it's just like a first point. The easiest path for the water to flow in the brain is empathy. It's the first place they
And it doesn't mean that it's a male-female divide either, but there will be a tendency.
It's a 70-30.
70-30 sort of, yeah.
Some, and even Jordan Peterson say some men are more feminine temperament, some women, but it's still a 70-30. So the point is, it's politically.
You're saying there's more than two genders, are you, Rob? You can't say that.
No, I'm saying personalities diverge. Yeah, but it's still a politically, in a democracy system where you need 51% of the votes, it's still a politically relevant template. And you know what? I've known about this for a long time, but I looked at the data coming out of the 2022 election, and even Labor think tanks are explicitly saying all around the world, left is women, right is men, young men. It's like you're getting a gender split there.
You know, I also wonder, you know, talking about this, because I've noticed that as people get older, you're one, I was probably one as well. We started with left tendencies, and as we got older, at, you know, accepting and adopting more responsibility, we moved right. Now, if you think about the family structure, which is fundamental, you know, it's the one of the oldest institutions, and everybody accepts the value, or you know, the vast majority of people accept the value of the family unit. When you have a family unit and you have kids, like you said before, kids aren't responsible, you know, at a very young age. Parents have to take responsibility for the children. But the role of a parent, the fundamental role of a parent, I would say, is to raise your children to be independent so that they can compete well in a competitive world. And so there's a shift, there's a trend from not being responsible to being independently responsible. And the governance over that, the parents and the family, they would act more like a socialist arrangement, you know, where they take the authoritarian control and take the responsibility and impose, you know, certain things. They don't give absolute freedom to the children, because that would be dangerous.
Right.
I mean,
there's an element of left-wing feminine infantilization, which Jordan Peterson would call the devouring mother.
Okay.
The mother that doesn't want the children to leave the nest.
Correct.
And as you were saying, what's the point with the gender stuff and our society now? I think that our move leftward is hand in hand with the fact that you could turn on a 90s sitcom and the dad doesn't have respect. I think largely to consume more productivity, it's undermining masculine virtues and masculinity in order to consume more, because it will be more. And it's not all men or all women, but it will be more of an archetypical masculine that looks forward into the future and sees more systems and looks at the GDP and the economy through time.
And says, we can't afford that, kids.
That's right.
Mum, go and ask your mother. Mum wants to give nurture, which is essential, and then it's dad that steps in and says, you can't have that, right?
That's right, because there's limits.
This is not a gender thing, right? But totally, okay? It's partially a bias.
But you argue with a left-wing person and they say you lack empathy. And vulnerable groups. This is the terminology they use, empathy. Well, I'm saying scientifically, the psychological science, they have an empathetic cognitive bias, but also vulnerable groups. I was talking about vulnerable groups. And is it this feminine nurturing We need to nurture the vulnerable groups. Whereas it's more, sometimes in some arenas, the dad's ability to say, you know what, through time we've got to make sure we don't go broke, and there needs to be limits. And unfortunately, you know, sometimes men have to act as a proxy for nature because scarcity is part of nature. Entropy is a part of nature, it's all the natural law stuff. But I think the demonization of masculine virtues throughout a culture has gone hand in hand with this political shift.
Demonization, we define masculinity. The feminist movement defines masculinity as toxic now.
Well,
and so it's like masculinity itself. We talked about
should.
toxic elements of masculinity once, or toxic masculinity. Now masculinity, period, is toxic.
Oh,
So
is it?
traditional masculinity, traditional, you know, I mean, any kind of aggression or not all violence is negative. Some violence is to protect.
My view is it's important that none of us demonize anything. You know, half of the people on the planet are male and half of the people on the planet are female.
Yep.
You know, we must cooperate together and play to our strengths.
Absolutely.
Which is what I said. Men and women are different. That doesn't mean that women can't do anything and men can't do anything. But you know, if you've got a strength, whatever that is, you would play to it.
But nature has provided this balance between the masculine and the feminine. You see this in
Division of
philosophy.
labour. A division of labour. We're different but compatible.
Yep.
And when you try to make people the same, you undermine that division of labour. You're actually undermining our value to provide value to each other. So our ability to provide value to each other, because you're undermining the division of labour.
Well, being different and compatible is very productive.
That's right. So that's once again coming into the entropy in the system. We've allowed the division of labour between I'm going to say not men and women, the masculine and the feminine, whichever way you personally are more inclined as a personality. But the division of labour between the masculine and feminine, we've undermined that productivity, and once again we're feeling the entropy in the system.
Wow.
And so to input energy to maintain that system, the division of labour, it's going to take some energy from the people who have the reserves of energy.
And resources.
And the resources.
Right. Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, guys, for this segment because we're out of time. But I want to keep going. So why don't we stick around and do a bit of a podcasty thing, and we'll put it up on demand for our ADH listeners, and we'll put it out on the other channels as well. So we'll stick around and have a bit more of a conversation. I didn't quite expect we were going to end up with a talk about gender and what's happening with gender in us, but it all fits together, doesn't it? The left, the right, the male, the female, feminism, feminism's connection with the left, and the Greens and the environmental issues and blah, blah, blah. Okay, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to unpack.
Together.
Well, maybe we should offer something approximating a solution.
Yes, well, just quickly, yeah, okay. So basically we need men to step up. We need capital to step up. We need people with money to start pulling their finger out and stop being so damn woke and starts defending traditional liberal free market values and capitalism and conservatism as it used to do.
Take responsibility.
Take responsibility, right. Okay,
I mean,
so sum
the
it up.
responsibility frame is perfect. My frame is entropy. Anything will entropy if you don't defend it, if you don't restore, if you don't put energy into it.
Okay, well,
You want a free society. We're in the situation where the left want a very different type of society. So they're analogous to an invading army. And we're sat here wanting to defend our society, the West, individual sovereignty, property rights, and the productivity that comes from all that. And we're saying, we want to fight, but you guys got all the money. Could you fund us some swords and shields?